Modern dating gets a lot of criticism. Bad matches, awkward small talk, someone lying about their height. But here's some perspective. For most of human history, you didn't even get to choose who you went on a date with. Professionals did it for you, sometimes using astrology, sometimes using outright kidnapping. And the results were exactly as chaotic as you'd expect. This is the actual history of ancient dating and courtship. And I promise, your worst Tinder date looks fantastic by comparison. Let's start in ancient Rome, because Rome had a genuine professional industry built entirely around getting two people to agree to marry each other, called the conciliatrix, a professional matchmaker, usually an older woman, who negotiated marriages on behalf of families for a fee. Here's the part that should sound familiar. Conciliatrices had a reputation, even at the time, for wildly overselling their clients. Roman writers openly mocked the profession for describing plain, difficult, or financially ruined men and women as devastatingly attractive, endlessly wealthy catches. Basically, ancient Rome invented the deceptively angled dating profile photo. They just did it with words instead of a camera. And because marriage in most of the ancient world was fundamentally a financial and political transaction between families, rather than a romantic choice between two people, matchmakers weren't selling chemistry, they were selling a deal. The bride and groom frequently met for the first time at, or very close to, the actual wedding. Imagine agreeing to marry someone based entirely on a matchmaker's pitch, then meeting them for the first time as the ceremony is happening. There was no "let's grab coffee first." There was just, "this is now your spouse, hope the matchmaker wasn't exaggerating." Ancient Chinese matchmaking followed a similarly formalized path, with professional go-betweens negotiating on behalf of families, checking astrological compatibility using birth charts, and finalizing the whole arrangement often before the couple had exchanged a single word. The matchmaker's job security depended entirely on the marriage looking good on paper. Whether the two humans involved got along was, at best, a secondary concern. And if you think meeting your spouse for the first time at your own wedding sounds stressful, wait until you hear about the cultures where the courtship ritual was, quite literally, a kidnapping. Several ancient and historical cultures had a formalized marriage by capture ritual. And the key word here is ritual, because in many documented cases, this was a symbolic, prearranged performance rather than an actual abduction. The couple and both families typically knew exactly what was happening in advance. It was theater, not crime. Among certain Roma communities historically, and in parts of the Caucasus and Central Asia, bride capture ceremonies involved the groom's friends staging a dramatic chase and symbolic seizure of the bride, who was often fully aware of and complicit in the plan. It let both families perform reluctance and drama publicly, while everyone privately understood the marriage had already been agreed to. Here's where it gets genuinely uncomfortable, though. Historians are clear that this ritual absolutely did, in a documented number of real historical cases, cross the line from performance into actual non-consensual abduction, particularly when families hadn't actually pre-negotiated anything and a suitor used the tradition as cover for a real kidnapping. The existence of a cultural script for pretend capture created real, serious risk that some men exploited. This wasn't uniformly a fun piece of wedding theater. The line between staged ritual and genuine crime was, in practice, dangerously thin and depended entirely on both families' honesty going in. On the lighter end of the same basic idea, some Viking marriage negotiations reportedly still carried a performative reluctance element even in fully consensual, family-arranged matches. The bride's side putting up a token, theatrical resistance during negotiations as a display of the bride's value, even when everyone in the room already knew the deal was done. So, arranged marriages, symbolic kidnappings, at least you knew who you were marrying by the wedding day, right? Not necessarily. Royal marriages across medieval and early modern Europe were frequently conducted entirely by proxy, meaning a stand-in, usually a nobleman representing the actual groom, would perform the wedding ceremony, sometimes even a symbolic bedding ritual with a fully clothed leg placed in the bed, while the real groom was in an entirely different country. This wasn't a fringe practice. Royal marriages were political alliances first, and physically transporting a monarch across a continent just to sign paperwork was often impractical. So a proxy stood in, vows were exchanged with the proxy, and the bride was, on paper, now married to a man she had never met, based on a ceremony performed with someone else entirely. And this created exactly the kind of disaster you'd expect. Portraits sent ahead as the only preview of what your future spouse actually looked like were notoriously, sometimes deliberately flattering. One of history's most famous versions of this went badly for King Henry VIII of England, who agreed to marry Anne of Cleves largely based on a portrait painted by Hans Holbein. When Anne actually arrived in England, Henry was reportedly so unhappy with how she compared to the portrait that the marriage was annulled after only 6 months. Essentially a royal, geopolitically significant version of "the photos were clearly outdated." If the portrait was already misleading, imagine what happened when the dowry negotiation itself completely fell apart. In dowry-based marriage systems spanning ancient Rome, medieval Europe, South Asia, and many other regions across history, the financial terms of the marriage, cash, land, livestock, goods handed over by the bride's family, were often negotiated with the same intensity as a modern corporate merger and could fall apart just as dramatically. Broken engagements over dowry disputes were common enough to generate their own body of historical legal disputes. If a dowry was promised and not delivered, or delivered short, entire marriages could be publicly called off. Sometimes after the wedding had already been announced, invitations effectively sent, reputations on the line, purely because the financial terms didn't check out. This wasn't a quiet, private disappointment. Depending on the culture and era, a broken engagement over money could become a matter of public record, community gossip, or even formal legal action between families. And here's the part that reveals how transactional this really was. Dowry amounts in many historical systems were adjusted based on things having absolutely nothing to do with the couple's compatibility. A bride's age, whether she'd been previously widowed, her family's social standing, sometimes even physical descriptions recorded in negotiation documents like she was livestock at an auction. Actual romantic attraction between the couple, in most negotiation records historians have available, doesn't even appear as a factor worth writing down. So if the honest version of ancient matchmaking was this transactional, you can imagine how well it went when people tried to fake their way to love instead. Love potions and magical romance scams were a real, documented, and apparently quite profitable ancient business. Ancient Greek and Roman sources reference professional purveyors of love charms and potions, sometimes herbal, sometimes purely fraudulent, sold to desperate clients hoping to make a specific person fall for them, or, in a good number of documented legal cases, to make an unfaithful spouse return. Roman law actually took this seriously enough to legislate against it. Certain love potions and poisons were bundled together under the same legal category because, unsurprisingly, give someone a substance to control their feelings or behavior against their will turns out to have a pretty high failure and poisoning rate. Several of these so-called love potions use genuinely toxic ingredients, meaning the ancient dating scam wasn't just emotionally dishonest, it was, in a fairly literal sense, sometimes attempted murder with extra emotional manipulation on top. Astrologers offering matchmaking services layered a second scam economy on top of the first. Professional astrological matchmakers in various ancient cultures charged real money to declare two people's birth charts compatible, with essentially zero accountability if the marriage they blessed later fell apart. It was financial-grade fortune-telling with a wedding attached. And once you actually did find someone, through a matchmaker, a kidnapping ritual, or a fraudulent astrologer, courtship itself came with its own absurd rulebook. Medieval European courtly love traditions, popularized through troubadour poetry and chivalric literature, established an entire etiquette system for how a knight was supposed to romantically pursue a noblewoman, almost always a woman who was already married to someone else, because courtly love was explicitly built around unattainable, idealized devotion rather than an actual functioning relationship. The rules were, frankly, ridiculous by any practical standard. A suitor was expected to perform elaborate, sometimes years-long displays of devotion, write poetry, undertake symbolic quests or trials, all while never actually consummating or formally acting on the relationship, because the entire point was suffering nobly from a distance. It was essentially an elaborate medieval social performance built around romantic frustration as an art form, devotion measured by how much you suffered for someone you couldn't have, rather than anything resembling a functional relationship. And underneath all of this, Actual unmarried courtship across most of history operated under intense chaperone surveillance. Young couples were rarely, if ever, allowed real private conversation before marriage, with family members or hired chaperones present specifically to prevent anything resembling an honest, unsupervised conversation about whether these two people actually liked each other. Here's what all of this actually adds up to. For the overwhelming majority of human history, romantic compatibility wasn't just a low priority in choosing a spouse. For most people, most of the time, it wasn't a factor being measured at all. Matchmakers sold exaggerated pitches, dowries were negotiated like corporate contracts, portraits lied, astrologers charged for compatibility they had no way of actually verifying. Modern dating apps get relentlessly mocked for reducing romance to profiles, algorithms, and exaggerated photos. But that's not a new problem technology created. That's just the conciliatrix with a smartphone. We didn't invent the deceptively flattering profile picture. We just stopped hiring a professional to lie on our behalf in person. So next time a dating app match doesn't look quite like their photos, take some comfort. At least you got to see a picture first. For most of history, you didn't find out what you were actually getting until the wedding day, or, in a few memorable royal cases, until several months into a marriage you were now stuck annulling. If you think matchmakers exaggerating a bride's dowry is bad, wait until next time. We're covering the ancient world's actual professional con artists and scam industries, and some of these schemes are more elaborate than anything running today. Subscribe so you don't miss it.
Make sure to subscribe for more epic content. And click that bell icon too.